You are listening to Christian America Ministries Worldwide, a weekly shortwave radio program and online podcast dedicated to uncensored, politically incorrect biblical teaching. Each week, your host, Matthew Dyer, and sometimes a guest, discuss an important topic and shed the light of Scripture upon it. To learn more about Christian America Ministries, visit our website, christianamericaministries.org. And now, the broadcast.
Greetings in the blessed holy name of our Lord Jesus Christ. Thank you for listening to Christian America Ministries Worldwide. I'm your host, Matthew Dyer, and we are broadcasting around the world on shortwave radio and over the internet at our YouTube channel, Christian America Ministries. You can also find us on TuneIn and Spotify as well. And if you'd like to learn more about this ministry, you can go to our website, christianamericaministries.org. And we would love to hear from our listeners, especially our shortwave listeners, which you can go to that website and look at our broadcast schedule, as well as send us a reception report. And you can do that by going and clicking the little radio icon at the right-hand corner of the screen. And just let us know how and where you're listening in the world. That helps us out a great deal to know who's listening on what frequencies and stations and what times. And if you do that, we will send you a free booklet from this ministry, as well as a QSL card for those that like that. And we just really appreciate our shortwave radio audience for doing that. Well, in this broadcast, we're going to go ahead and get to the subject at hand. I have a guest on the program today, one we've had on in past programs, Michael A. Hoffman. I think the last time we had him on, we were talking about his book, They Were White and They Were Slaves. And I had the pleasure of meeting Mr. Hoffman at a funeral a few years ago, a funeral of Pastor Dave Barley. And since then, I've really appreciated his friendship and getting to know him a little bit better with these radio broadcasts. And I asked him a few weeks ago to come on the program and talk about his book, Judaism's Strange Gods. And I think this is a very important topic to discuss, especially religiously and politically in the world. And I've asked him to come on and share some knowledge with us. So, Mr. Hoffman, thank you for coming on the program and taking the time to do this. Real quick, before we start, why don't you tell my audience a little bit about yourself before we get into your book?
Well, thank you for having me, Matthew, and please call me Michael. I'm a former reporter for the New York Bureau of the Associated Press. I was educated at the State University of New York at Oswego, where I met a Palestinian professor who had quite an influence on me. Faiz Abu Jaber was his name. He steered me toward local history. At that time, I aspired to write history of World War II and some grandiose topics like that, and I wasn't actually qualified at that time as an undergraduate. And he said, why don't you look at your own backyard? He was aware that I was from the Finger Lakes region of upstate New York. And he said, the Freemasons murdered a writer who had published a book about their secrets in a place called Canandaigua, New York. He was kidnapped from there. Are you familiar with that? And I said, yeah, it's 14 miles up the road. I guess I better start looking into it. So that was a good thing for meeting Dr. Abu Jaber. I went to work for the Associated Press for a few years, and that didn't really work out because you can imagine how much I was censored. And eventually I was working for a New York radio station, and I broadcast a documentary called Zionism, Racism, and the Beirut Massacre in 1982, connected with the bombing, the carpet bombing, which the Israelis are doing now as we speak in Lebanon, and continuing horrific crimes in Gaza. But in 1982, they terror bombed the city of Beirut in June, July, and August of 1982, killing tens of thousands of people, terror bombing schools, hospitals, apartment buildings. And it was a well-documented thing, and I ended up being fired. And most of the Gentiles on the radio program, the non-Judaic people, fled and wouldn't assist me. And I contacted Dr. Noam Chomsky, a Judaic opponent of the Israeli state and of Zionism, who at that time was Institute Professor of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and a very busy man, world-renowned scholar. He went to bat for me. This Jewish academic contacted the owners of the radio station for 2 days. He was pressuring them to reinstate me. In the end, they wouldn't, and he wasn't successful. But I ended up establishing a lifelong relationship with Noam. He suffered a catastrophic stroke in his late 80s or early 90s, and he's incapacitated now and living with his second wife in Brazil. But that experience was very interesting. We certainly didn't always agree, but he appreciated my research. So from there, I went to work for various newspapers and magazines, including the old Spotlight for those of your listeners and
Hmm.
viewers who remember that in Washington, D.C., under Mr. Willis Carto. And then eventually I was assistant director of the Institute for Historical Review in Torrance, California. Later on, we moved to Costa Mesa. And then I started my own company, Independent History and Research. And since that time, God has given me the ability, the grace, and support from people who believe in my truth mission to write 10 books of history and literature. I've been working on the 11th one. It's turning out to be the most difficult of them all for some reason. I'm not entirely sure, although it's going to be a big book. But those books have never been out of print, and some of them have been bestsellers, Secret Societies and
Hmm.
Psychological Warfare. They Were White and They Were Slaves that you referenced, Judaism, Strange Gods, which is actually a condensation of a textbook I wrote called Judaism Discovered, which is 1,100 pages, but not everybody can have set aside the time to study that. So I wrote a condensation called Judaism, Strange Gods, revised and expanded. I believe you have the original edition, and this is the
Yeah.
revised and expanded edition right here, and this is the one I recommend. I'm on Substack. I write a column on Substack. People can reach me at michaelhoffman.substack.com. Our website is revisionisthistory.org, where people can purchase our books. And I'm very happy to be on your program today, sir.
Well, I appreciate it, Michael. I was watching a video that you posted just a few months ago where you were talking about this book, both of them actually, the expanded and the one you had in your hand, where this book and I guess others of yours have been banned on Amazon and other places. Is that correct?
Some of our books have not been banned on Amazon, but in the, around 2017, I believe it was, Jeff Bezos, who had earlier pledged when he was not a billionaire to avoid any type of censorship except of books
Hmm.
that were pornographic or came right out and advocated violence. But then he reneged on that promise under pressure from the usual suspects, and hundreds of books were removed,
Hmm.
including books that they had promoted. On the Amazon Kindle, they helped me get one of the books that they eventually banned onto the Kindle and helped smooth those situations. They were basically libertarians at that phase of Mr.
Yeah.
Bezos' life, and I hope he returns to it at some point. But yes, The Great Holocaust Trial, my book about Ernst Zundel's trial in
Hmm.
1985, where I was present in the press gallery. Judaism Discovered and Judaism Strange Gods were all banned at a time when on the Kindle, the U.S. I'll parenthetically state that the U.S. Postal Service unfortunately was privatized by or semi-privatized by Richard Nixon in the 1970s,
Yeah.
and then is beginning now under tremendous financial pressure to price itself out of existence. And what they did was they abolished sea mail. It used to be that you could take some big books like mine, put them in a package, mark it sea mail, and for seven
Hmm.
or eight or nine or $10, it might take 2 months to reach truth-hungry people in Laos, Cambodia, or Lithuania, or Poland, or wherever in the
Yeah.
world they wanted to be. Now you have to send it at an airmail rate, and it's prohibitively expensive. It can be 60 or 80 or
Yeah.
$90 to ship a big book over there. And so we had the Amazon Kindle, and that was something where, for example, for some reason, people in India, and I often ask a kind of Jeopardy quiz show question, where is the largest body of English literate people in the world? And people often say, well, after America, it must be England or it must be Canada. And actually,
Hmm.
it's India. I mean, with 1
Yeah.
billion people, the
Yeah.
British had colonized it, and therefore English is the coin of the realm, so to speak, the lingua franca. And so what happened was on Kindle, we were starting to get I think we priced the book on Kindle at 9.95. We're starting to get 100 orders a month and then 200 orders a month. This was starting to be some real money for our truth mission and also reaching a brand new group of elite people in India, which I was glad to do. And it was at that point where someone had spotted that on Amazon and they moved in to crush that and remove even the printed
Hmm.
copies of the book. But my other books are there, and I'm grateful for that. And also, we, as I say, sell them from our website as well.
Well, fantastic. We'll give that website out at the end of the broadcast. Well, concerning your book, Judaism, Strange Gods, or Judaism Discovered, What led you to write that book? And then can you kind of lay out what the book is all about, at least the shorter version? Because I think that's what my listeners will really like to hear, because as you know, the topic of Judaism has exploded in the last couple of years. And at least I've noticed that it's more acceptable to talk about than it was maybe 20 years ago. Have you noticed that as well?
I have, yes. I originally I had a dear friend, one of the finest Bible scholars that I ever personally knew. That was Charles D. Provan,
Hmm.
Provan. He wrote two books. The Church is Israel Now, which many Christian Israel people would not agree with. And the other one was The Bible and Birth Control, which was very interesting and influence on me and pointing me towards having a large family with my wife. But he was also a scholar of the Talmud, of the Babylonian Talmud. And Pastor Herman Otten was running a Lutheran newspaper called Christian News in the 1980s, and he published a series of Chuck's analysis of the Talmud, including photographically reproducing sections of the Sonsino Talmud, which was the only reliable English version at that time. Since then, the Steinsaltz Talmud has emerged. And in fact, the entire Steinsaltz Talmud in this age that I call the Revelation of the Method era is available free of charge at sepharia.org. That's Sefaria, sepharia.org. And you just look up under Talmud and it will be the Steinsaltz Talmud. Now, the best edition of that is the hardcover edition published partially by Random House. At some point, the Talmud is an average of 35 to 40 volumes in English, depending on the translation. And Random House, I think, published about 20 volumes before they just stopped it. And that was the absolutely most uncensored version, most candid version of the Talmud I've seen in English. And so the version on Sepharia.org is largely uncensored. There's been a few redactions or attempts to lessen some of the more severe hate speech passages which are there, but nonetheless, it's generally reliable. I would say 98% reliable, and I recommend it. So Chuck pointed me in that direction. I was also interested in the words of Jesus about the traditions of the elders in Mark 7 and Matthew 15, and that always fascinated me. Let's know more about these traditions of the elders. And as I delved into it with Chuck's assistance, I found myself encountering some of the hoaxes and distortions, for example, about the word Torah. And this comes
Hmm.
out in my book as well. We have some anti-Zionist Judaic people, largely Hasidic, based in New York City and upstate New York, the Satmar Hasidim, for example, and others like them who are really almost violently opposed to the Israeli state. They refuse to be drafted into the Israeli army, and so they're doing some good work there as far as that goes. Nonetheless, they are loyal to the Babylonian Talmud in every respect. And we have to keep in mind that because they call themselves Torah true Jews, the Torah true Jews. And that's very attractive to Christians, especially those of us who are Bible researchers and we're looking
Hmm.
into the Pentateuch and the first five books of the Bible, which is so important to us and we believe is a living document even in our New Testament age. And so, anyway, I thought, well, there's a terrible distortion and disparity and misunderstanding here because to call yourself, when you're a rabbinic Talmudist, as being Torah true is kind of disingenuous because the first thing that we need to know about Orthodox Judaism, and I have to distinguish here between Reform Judaism and Orthodox Judaism. Reform Judaism was a reaction to Christian critiques and secular critiques as well of the Talmud as being a sinkhole and cesspool of fantasy and sexual pornography and hate speech. And so some Judaic people, including rabbis, took those criticisms to heart and formed Reform Judaism, which largely jettisoned the Talmud to a very secondary, low priority status and emphasized other aspects of Judaism, including, for example, the prophets Isaiah and Jeremiah, although still, I would argue, in a distorted way. So, Orthodox Judaism is the Judaism which is faithful to the Talmud. They call themselves Talmud observant or Frum, F-R-U-M. And there's a big problem with that when you're claiming to be a Torah true Jew. And here we have to go into the Hebrew in order to understand the distinction. So, The Tanakh, or the Old Testament, is in its form of the Pentateuch, is known as the Torah Biktav. That's the Torah that God gave to Moses. Now the oral tradition comes along, and that is an emendation, misinterpretation, and distortion of the original books of the Bible, and that is called the Torah Shebil Pech. And so you have two Torahs here, the written and the oral. And until the Pharisees and the others at the time crucified the Savior of Israel, God had not allowed that evil oral Torah to be committed to writing. But once they had gone so far degenerate as crucifying their own Messiah, then we begin to see the emergence of what has since been called the Talmud, the Mishnah, which is the committing of the writing of the gnosis that the Pharisees presented to Jesus in their disputations with him were committed to writing after his crucifixion and resurrection in a book called the Mishnah. And then the interpretation and the legal interpretation of the Mishnah became the Gemara, and that is the Babylonian Talmud. And this all happened in the first few centuries AD, including in Babylon itself. And I think it's an interesting warning that God allowed these series of books to be known as the Babylonian Talmud, because for those of us who are Christians, Babylon is a citadel of paganism and superstition. There is also a competing version, but it hasn't succeeded, and that's called the Jerusalem Talmud, but it has almost no authority in Orthodox Judaism and is largely considered kind of a nostalgia piece and an antique. The Babylonian Talmud is the one that has force of law. Now, so if we understand there's two Torahs, and the Orthodox are committed to the oral Torah, the Torah Shebil Pech, and they also consider that of greater importance than God's Torah to Moses, then we're moving along with some basic knowledge of Judaism. And this is how, for example, the Karaites, which is a dissident group of Judaics who hold only to the Old Testament. Now, most American Christians think that's what Orthodox Judaism is. It's just loyal to the Old Testament, and it rejected the New Testament. But as the Karaites themselves have pointed out, that's not at all true. The Talmud replaces the Bible as pride of place and source of law for Talmudism, for the Orthodox rabbinate. And so the Karaites descended from that. They were heavily persecuted, even killed by rabbis in the 6th, 7th, and 8th century, when it really became institutionalized as a competing religion. So that's important to keep in mind. And then the next factor that we have to understand here is the extent to which, when people say that the Talmud is just a series of debates. This is another thing which the Judeo-Churchians, I don't honor them with the name Christian.
Amen.
They're snout down in churchianity. It's not Christianity. So the Judeo-Churchians will say, well, they just are regurgitating what they've been told by somebody like Ben Shapiro or somebody like that. They haven't done the study themselves, and they're basically saying, well, it's just a series of debates. And in order to show that it isn't, you have to delve deeper into some complexities of Judaism, Talmudism actually, related to how the Talmud and the Bible are interpreted. And that's a complex series of rules that are hermeneutic in nature. So that what you have is, during the time of Jesus, there arose a Pharisee by the name of Hillel. And Hillel had a school, the school of Hillel. It doesn't mean that it was a literal academy, but he had a following. In other words, he had disciples. He also had a rival named Shammai. And Shammai also had a school and a series of disciples. Now, Shammai in Orthodox Talmudism represents the stricter interpretation of the Mishnah, the book that was the encapsulation of the Pharisees' theology committed to writing. Whereas Hillel has a more lenient approach to interpreting the Mishnah. And so through those two schools and several others, which are known as, and this gets a little bit confusing, but I think it's worth presenting to your listeners and viewers, as the Zugot pairs, Z-U-G-O-T. And so what they are is, they are indicators throughout the reading of the Babylonian Talmud. It's 35 or 40 volumes, which is written largely in Aramaic, by the way, not Hebrew, where to enforce a law and where to not enforce it, because the two prime aspects of Orthodox Talmudism, its characteristics are self-worship, that they themselves are God, and situation ethics, from which that situation ethics invaded Christendom, both through the Catholic Church, the Church of Rome, and into Protestantism, and especially on the issue of usury. And I wrote a book about this called the Usury in Christendom, the mortal sin that was and now is not. But so returning to this notion, you can't really understand that the Talmud is an authoritative law book, okay? All kinds of laws are predicated upon it. For example, the Mishneh Torah of Moses Maimonides, who is the supreme legal authority in Ashkenazic Judaism. And his Mishneh Torah, which is a multi-volume series of laws, all drawn from inferences that he has taken from the Gemara, that other part of the Talmud that I talked about. And so in order to understand that these are not debates, but it's either the school of Shammai or the school of Hillel that's being applied, you have to understand that it goes by the zeitgeist. In other words, the spirit of the age. Where Judaic people are persecuted, where rabbis are suppressed, where the religion, for example, under the czars of Russia, is not able to fully have the kind of power that it has in the United States today, or the total power that it has in occupied Palestine, then a different set of laws and rules in Talmudism are brought to the fore in order to enhance the survival of the rabbis during this period when they are suppressed. And what looks like debates is actually exegetical signals between different schools on whether we're going to go in this direction, in the Shammai direction, the direction of stringency, or we're going to go in the direction of Hillel, the direction of leniency. And then there are also other Zugat pairs. It's a very complex hermeneutic process. And most of the people who are Christians, who are advocates of the Talmud, such as Reverend Douglas Wilson of Christ Church in Moscow, Idaho, the spiritual advisor to Secretary of War Pete Hegseth, he doesn't know what he's talking about. I've challenged him to debate, and he told me that my audience was too small. In other words, I'm not well known enough in order for him to foray into a debate. Well, I thought the essence of a debate is discover the truth. And if I am the most formidable opponent that he has in his attempt to rehabilitate the Talmud among Christians, as he did in his book, American Milk and Honey, where he said 2 cheers for the Talmud rather than 3, he gave a qualified endorsement of it. These are things that he has not explored. I don't know where he's gotten his limited knowledge of the Talmud, but it doesn't involve this exegetical analysis of how law is applied inside Judaism. And so that's one way, if you're looking at my book, Judaism, Strange Gods, or you're looking into Judaism Discovered, especially in the 1100 pages of Judaism Discovered, I lay out how this complex exegetical process is employed by the rabbis in making the Talmud a law book, and a law book which nullifies, as Jesus said in Mark 7 and Matthew 15, the word of God. Because in the Mishnah and the Talmud themselves, they say the Talmud, they openly say it, the Talmud is more important than the Bible. It openly says that God had a debate with the rabbis and he was defeated by the rabbis. And he celebrates that fact. He says, my sons have defeated me. My sons have defeated me. And he's jubilantly celebratory about these rabbis allegedly defeating the Lord of the universe. So you can imagine the megalomania that is attached to this religion. And the best thing we can do if we love Judaic people is to free them from it. This is why they're tied up, and many Jews, of course, are anti-Zionist, but many other Judaic people are heavily committed to the mass murders that the Israelis are committing in Gaza and in Lebanon, and has done so for decades. And so what are they doing? They're saying that it's anti-Semitic to bring the truth of these mass murders to the fore. In other words, their hurt feelings are more important than preventing the deaths of the innocent there. This is all a product of the megalomania of the Talmud itself. So if you can disconnect them from the Talmud and disconnect them from that excessive pride, that insane vanity, you're bringing them back into the humanitarian sphere of all human beings should be, where we're expressing the love of Christ and understanding. This is what I'm seeking between Judaic people and Christians, a true basis for a mutual understanding. And I think I will turn it over to you in a minute. I just want to say that I warn people about Jew hate, because Jew hate
Hmm.
functions as a device of the Zionists themselves. There is a
Yeah.
statement when Judaic kids are growing up and they're going into the Talmud schools, that Esau hates Jacob, and it's in Hebrew, and it sort of sounds rather basic. Esau, it's a given fact that Esau hates Jacob. Okay. But from that, the inference is drawn that no matter what a Judaic person does, however good they are, however beneficial, they will be hated. And this is a way of keeping them inside the Talmudic fold. Whereas if they
Hmm.
understand that Christians are more than willing to love anybody and accept them as as part of the people of God. And again, Christian Israel has a different understanding of that, but I think we concede the humanity. We have to concede the humanity of all
Hmm.
human beings. Otherwise, we're Talmudic. It's the
Hmm.
Talmud which says that Gentiles are nephesh deficient, in other words, deficient in soul and therefore subhuman. Maimonides decreed, and many Southern slave owners picked up on Maimonides. He had high status among slaveholders, some slaveholders in the South, some Christians in the South, and he said that he decreed that black people were midway between the ape and the human being, and that what distinguished them from not entirely being an animal is that they had the power of speech. And that's in his uncensored book. When you get the uncensored translation by Shlomo Pines, that is in volume 2 of his book, Guide of the Perplexed. It's not Guide for the Perplexed, it's Guide of the Perplexed, published by the University of Chicago in the early 1960s. That should be volume 2, page around 618. So if we fall into this idea that other races or ethnicities are subhuman, we're becoming Talmudic. We're becoming like Maimonides. And in fact, the Talmud itself says that it was black people that were hereditarily assigned slave
Hmm.
status due to what happened on board Noah's Ark. And because there's
Yeah.
women and children listening to this broadcast, I'm not going to say what the Talmud says was done by Ham on board Noah's Ark. Well, the Bible has no racial identification of them whatsoever. That's from the Talmud. And again,
Hmm.
certain Southern slaveholders and others picked up on that and used that against black people. So we have to concede humanity if we want to be non-Talmudic. And Jew hate functions in this way as wiping out every single person who was born genetically. And of course, I don't really believe that most Judaic people are Israel. So, I mean, we're
Hmm.
actually talking about the Khazars to a large extent. And there have been
Yeah.
many studies, based on that. And I always recommend Arthur Kessler's The 13th
Hmm.
Tribe for newbies in this particular regard. But however, whatever genetic assignment we give to them, the idea that people are irretrievably lost due to their race and cannot be reached is a fundamental Talmudic dogma, and it is not of us. Okay. And so this is where I warn people that where you're not finding a skeptical scrutiny of Judaism that is not done in charitably and benevolently, watch out, because these are either unconscious agents of the Zionists, or they actually are been put up by the Zionists themselves, as we're finding out that the Southern Poverty Law Center was paying various neo-Nazis and Klansmen to act
Hmm.
out these theatrical Hollywood roles as haters. And this
Yeah.
phenomenon is at work inside this particular controversy in this field that we're working in here today, talking about.
Yeah. I want it to be clear for those listening that Michael Hoffman's book is not a volume of Jew hatred, just page after page after page. What it is facts. It's facts presented with quotations from these the Talmud and other writings from Jews to present facts, not just blanket hatred on, like so many books before that have been written. So I want everybody to understand that it is a very academic and well-researched book, and that trying to get to the bottom of the truth of what is taught in Judaism. And I also wanted to comment, I have a small platform too compared to Douglas Wilson, but maybe those listening out there, maybe they can send this interview to him and encourage a debate, because I think everyone listening would love to hear a debate between you and Douglas Wilson on this topic. And I know I have been quite flabbergasted by some of the comments that he's made about Judeo-Christianity, so in quotations, just recently, including his comments about the USS Liberty and everything like that. So yeah, I think a debate between you two would be wonderful, and it would be a blessing to our people if that was to come to pass.
Yeah, he's a big disappointment. He has done some marvelous work in the past. He helped to co-found the classical Christian academies
Hmm.
across America. I think there's now a couple dozen or more of them. He founded New St. Andrew's College in Moscow. He's known, and this has been substantiated as far as I'm concerned, as an outstanding marriage counselor in these days with rampant pornography and
Yeah.
adultery, which is called an affair. He had an
Hmm.
affair. Well, let's get rid of that euphemism and call it what it is.
Amen.
He committed adultery, and
Amen.
Wilson has just been really good, really rock solid in counseling people with both a sense of humor. I remember I went to one of his conferences about relations between married men and women, and he was talking about how when guys feel that the wife has sort of wandered off the reservation a little bit, not in terms of adultery, but maybe challenging the husband's authority and things like that. And he leavened his talk with humor. He said, listen, after you've heard my talk, don't go home and say, there's a new sheriff in town. He said, because that isn't going to work with your wife. And, so it seemed very human, normal, biblically based. And I think he had a
Hmm.
tremendous potential. He's a fine homilist and things like that. But in this perverse generation that we're in, the evil spirits target somebody like that. And I don't know where,
Yeah.
from what direction he came out with this thing about two cheers for the Talmud. Okay. And the funny thing is, in that book of his, American Milk and Honey, which I reviewed in my Substack column,
Hmm.
michaelhoffman.substack.com, I talked about how he actually is one of the first apologists for the Talmud, again, in a qualified, limited way, who acknowledges some, although not majority, of the hate speech, pornography against Jesus and Mary in the Talmud, and then proceeds onward to say that it's still worthy and helpful for Christians to use it as a guide to the Old Testament when it is a
Hmm.
nullification of the Old Testament. And it's almost like saying, well, I was reading Hitler's Mein Kampf, and despite the fact that it advocates genocide, and I know there's Hitler people who say that it doesn't, but if you look at his anti-Slavic prejudices, one of the reasons why he rolled over Poland and hated Russia was he was an occult hater of the Slavic white race. But that's another story for another time. But
Yeah.
suppose someone was to say, well, we can overlook that because there's some good things in Mein Kampf. Well, most people would be horrified. They would just write that person off because what they would say is, look it, maybe there are some good things in Mein Kampf, but what you're doing, even with this limited endorsement, is bringing Hitler into a rehabilitative state of like, let's take a second look at Hitler and the good that he's done. And that is simply unacceptable because Adolf Hitler, I wrote a book called Adolf Hitler, Enemy of the German People, and I documented the murders of his own people. He was kind of like Trump, where Trump promised not to get us into foreign wars and to improve the
Hmm.
economy, to bring out the Epstein files, and he did the opposite. Hitler
Yeah.
promised that he was going to overthrow usury banking. And what he did was he overthrew the Judaic end of usury banking and enhanced the Nordic or so-called Aryan version of it. And it was a complete betrayal. And one of the men who called him out on that he had executed. So people really don't know the actual history of Adolf Hitler. And I'm a revisionist. I don't believe everything that's been told about this liturgical understanding of World War II. It shouldn't be a religion. World War II should be open to all kinds of dissent. And
Yeah.
so I've been part of that dissent. But in that particular case, I have found many evils associated with Adolf Hitler, including his occult initiation in the Thule Society, Thule, which is based on theosophy. Anyhow, if someone was to say there's good things in the Mein Kampf, most of us would say, look it, we can't have another Hitler. We can't have that brought up again. A guy who had godlike powers over the German people. There were no checks and balances on him as our blessed founding fathers installed in America. Congress, the legislature, the judiciary, and the executive. There was nothing. Hitler was much more in the Oriental line of leadership, where you are a godlike tyrant and no one can dispute that. And that's how the Germans lost big in Russia and in other areas. So I would never accept that. You've got some good things in Mein Kampf. No, we can't have Hitler rehabilitate. You've got some good things in the Talmud. God only knows what they might be, but we can't have the Talmud rehabilitated, a book that says that Jesus is in hell burning in excrement. Okay, we can't have that. That Jesus is the illegitimate child of a Roman soldier named Pandora. That Mary was a harlot, Miriam the hairdresser, and so forth and so on. I won't pollute your ears with all of it. I've documented it in my books. And so Wilson claiming that there are certain esoteric, abstruse understandings of the Old Testament that you can get from Judaism's holiest book, and that's what the Talmud is. It's not the Bible, it's its holiest book. This is crazy, absolutely crazy. And yes, I would love to confront him, but he knows me. I've met him before his book was published. He emailed me and said that I'm going to have some revelations about the Talmud in my book, and I want your reaction to it and so forth. And we collaborated to a certain extent. I'm not going to say we were friends or research partners, but he certainly has met me, and we did have a meeting of the minds at one point. And yet, here's where he went. And on the USS Liberty, you're absolutely right, is that he denied that that was a war crime committed deliberately by the Israelis, when Admiral Thomas Moorer, Moorer, former head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and several other Navy admirals all signed off on the fact that was a deliberate attack, as the survivors themselves do, including Jewish American sailors who were on that ship. It's completely unacceptable where he came up. That was his attempt to refute some of Charlie Kirk's people who were picking up on the USS Liberty. And the anniversary of that 1967 atrocity is coming up here this weekend. But anyhow, yeah, so now why is Wilson important? I mean, he's largely a provincial, an educator, well, he's important because the head of what used to be called the Department of Defense, Pete Hegseth, is a close ally of his and sees him as his spiritual guide. And Hegseth has written off the innocent Iranians that were murdered by there was no reason to attack Iran. All this stuff about nuclear weapons and everything else, it reminds me of Iraq with the weapons of mass destruction. There was no need for that. And yet Hegseth seemed to gloat over the deaths of those people. And I have to say that I really wonder about the American people in the state of our hypnotic state. When I've talked to people and they say, well, we have to stop Iran, it'll have the nuclear bomb and it'll attack us. Iranians don't have any missiles that can reach the United States, okay? The Iranians have Christian churches in their land. The Iranians have had goodwill towards America until the CIA overthrew their elected representative in 1953 and installed the Shah of Iran. That's where we begin to earn their enmity. Meanwhile, there's a place called North Korea, where hundreds of thousands of Christians are in prison right now, where no church is allowed, where they're allied with the murderous Maoist regime in China. They have between 40 and 80 nuclear weapons and missiles that can reach any part of the United States, from Maine to Florida to Seattle to Los Angeles. And yet Mr. Trump, the supposed tough guy American and everything else, wouldn't dare to take on North Korea. He wouldn't dare to attack that country. He's backed off from that. He's a cowardly bully, just like Netanyahu and the Israelis have been toward the Iranians. Only, Matthew, surprise, surprise, these are not Arabs. These are Persians with 3,000 years. Western civilizations had a tough time with the Persians over history. 3,000 years of military and martial traditions. And look at how they fooled them, even after we decapitated their leadership. And Netanyahu had told Mr. Trump that they were going to have regime change there and the people would overthrow the government. The whole thing was just a lie from the Israelis. And the next generation of Iranians rose up and, of course, as you know, stopped the Strait of Hormuz and the shipping. And they now have us. Actually, they have the advantage over us and the Israelis. And so this is all part of the terrible, I associate it more like a gas or a process of osmosis, where this fear of the Jews, which the Bible says existed prior to Pentecost, but is supposed to be gone after Pentecost, is still with many of our people. And a lot of the women who have stood up to this, especially Marjorie Taylor Greene, the former congresswoman from Georgia, has said, where are the men? Where are the men in Congress? And we sometimes wonder about how women are wearing the pants in the family and beginning to take on certain roles that they normally would not.
Indeed.
And the thing about that is, when men are pusillanimous and won't have the courage to do what is necessary to do, then the women will step into it, because our women are very courageous historically. You have Queen Isabella in Spain, the one that sent Columbus. She and her husband sent Columbus to the Americas. She was a warrior. You have these mothers and wives of the pioneers who set off in the wagon trains, and when it was necessary, they picked up a rifle, they picked up a gun, and they defended their families, and they did so valiantly. So that's the record there. Now, they're intended by God to be nurturers and mothers, but if we're not going to fulfill that role, they will step in, and we have no right to criticize them until we get our testicular fortitude back. So
Amen.
that's how I feel about these things. And I think at the basis of it is the essential racism of the Talmud. When you're seeing how daily people are being murdered in Lebanon right now, and formerly in Gaza, although killings of Gazans are still going on, when we see that, and it's business as usual in America. If those were Israelis were being killed on that daily basis, it would be a 5-alarm fire editorially and in the minds of the U.S. government. What can we do to stop the Holocaust? And well, this is another Holocaust, and yet it doesn't register, because the racism of the Talmud, even among people who've never opened a Daf Yomi, in other words, never seen a page of the Talmud, but by a process of osmosis have picked up this Talmudic arrogance and conceit that the only humans are the Judaics and whoever wants to assist them in their Zionist conspiracy. And the rest of the world just doesn't count, just doesn't factor in. This is harming us tremendously. The United States used to have such goodwill under somebody like President John F. Kennedy. Kennedy, of course, tried to interdict the Israeli nuclear weapons industry, which is one of the reasons why he was assassinated, as Michael Collins Piper has documented, and others.
Yeah.
And, they were mostly about goodwill, the Peace Corps, and trying to project an image. I know there was the CIA undermining that, but that's, there's always this evil. We're not going to have peace, until Jesus comes again, as far as, a true peace. Every time we try to build heaven on earth, we create a hell on earth. So we're not going to have a utopia here, but we do need to make Christ king. And one of the ways that we do it is that we do not kill the innocent. And you can say what you want about the Pope of Rome. I've written a whole 723-page book criticizing the Renaissance Church of Rome, but I was very interested when Pope Leo XIV was told to butt out of politics, and he said, well, in defending the Palestinians in Gaza, he said, I'm defending the innocent, and that is the mission of Christ. And those words, apart from anything else he may have said or done, were absolutely true. And it was an alarm to the rest of churchianity and true Christianity to say, this is where we have to stand. We have a plague of the murder of the most innocent, which is abortion in this country, which is actually infanticide when you're killing babies at 5, 6, 7, 8, and even 9 months, which just shatters my ability to even picture that. And so you have that bloodshed. Many Christians can see that because the babies are the least of his brethren, as Jesus said, whatever you do to the least of my brethren, you do to me. Well, you mean to tell me that this sizable Christian population in Lebanon, and for that matter, the non-Christian, are not Jesus' brethren? The women and children, kids being killed on their way to school, as we did in Iran, blowing up that entire school. No one's ever gotten to the bottom of that yet. And Hegseth refusing to concede that we may have overstepped our bounds in that particular regard. And I wonder to what extent he's being driven by these various preachers of churchianity, which you may know more about than I do, because you're probably confronting so many of people coming into your congregation who are trying to free themselves of that. but you see the vestiges of that philosophy and theology in their mindset. And we can't really overcome that without the grace of God, because sometimes it's God himself who sends strong delusion because people have a inferior regard for the truth. He says, if you have an insufficient regard for the truth, I will send you strong delusion so you will believe a lie. So some of
That's
these
true.
people, we can't overcome their delusion because it comes from God, because he wants us to love the truth above everything else, to put that at the very top of what it means to be a Christian. And if it isn't, if there's anything else other than the truth at the top, then I think that we're lost and we're just denizens of churchianity.
The Lord has to open the eyes to those that we're presenting truth to. You can write the best book in the world, you can give the best sermon in the world, but unless the Lord opens their eyes to see it, that's the only way they're going to see it. And that doesn't mean he doesn't use men like Michael and other men, but we need to understand God is the one that opens the eyes of the people. And I'm really glad that well, before I say that, I do want to say to my audience concerning the USS Liberty, which you mentioned a little while ago. We've had Phil Turney on the program before, and I will be playing that interview that I had with him up on the anniversary coming up. I wanted to mention that in case anyone on the radio wants to listen to it. But I'm glad that you shifted gears of this conversation to Iran and the events going on over there, because the results of Judeo-Churchianity that has infected the world and affected America is we see the results, the conclusion of that, the results of that in this conflict in Iran, with the relationship of America with the Israeli state, and so many other things. And it's coming to fruition because it started in the pulpit, whether it be men like Douglas Wilson in the ear of other men that are in influence. We see that openly being spoken about in men in government, about or in women, of a Judeo-Christian ethic, and that's opposed to in the scriptures, and it's something that we need to oppose if we are Christian. But it's very important to realize the things that Michael is speaking about, things he wrote about in his book, are the conclusion we're seeing out in the real world right now, and that is the effect of Talmudism in the world.
Yes, absolutely. Very well said. That's exactly where I think we need to educate ourselves about Judaism, because so many people are so weak in this particular area, and they're not
Hmm.
willing to read a whole book anymore. They want to
Yeah.
just watch a video. Well, I got most of it from the video. No, you didn't.
It's a
My
big
my
subject.
one book is 1,100 pages. The other is 416. I don't deliberately make anything complex. I'm an educator, so I try to the best of my knowledge to impart this to people in a way that they can absorb it. But I'm not going to simplify it or dumb it down, because then you're not equipped to really debate the people out there in
Yeah.
society that you need to encounter who are so filled with these deceptions. You have to have a real grounding, and a pamphlet or a flyer or a newsletter isn't going to cover it. It may
No.
stimulate your interest, but ultimately we have to sit down with the book, whatever that book may be, and study it, take notes, and that's the way we educate ourselves. And I wish that more and more Americans would be oriented that way, because really, most of the deceptions that are inflicted on us are easy to refute if we have the knowledge. It's largely because what's being said is an insult to our intelligence. For someone like me to hear some of the nonsense that's said about what the Bible teaches about the Israeli Zionist state, or how the Talmud is essentially a beneficial book and things like that. These are easily refuted statements by people who have the knowledge and the education. And if I were in charge of things, I mean, I would not necessarily my book. There's another book by Israel Shahak, Jewish History, Jewish Religion, The Weight of 3,000 Years. He was an Israeli, a wonderful Israeli of goodwill. That's a great introduction. But whatever you want to use to study, make yourself a real Barley Christian, okay, and a
Hmm.
Berean who is looking into these things and proving yourself to be worthy of the grace that you've been given as a Christian, rather than taking shortcuts. There are no shortcuts to this, and we need many more people, not just myself or Matthew Dyer, to bring these things to the fore, but be rooted in real knowledge and facts, so that when you're put up in a debate, or when you're even discussing in the back of the church after the service, you can hold your own ground and be a real representative of the truth of Jesus Christ. And I believe then that you're almost putting the Lord of the universe under obligation to you because he loves it when you have a sufficient love for the truth. And this is what our
Mhm.
people need, and that means getting to work. If you want to be a carpenter, you have to start as an apprentice, and it's a long road. Our plumber and electrician, noble trades. And if you want to be an educator in this regard, the same effect is in force. And that's what's necessary, in my opinion.
I agree. And this is a big subject. Anything to do with Judaism and the Jews and how we've gotten to where we are today is a very big subject. I mean, you don't write an 1,100 page book if it's not. And it's there's a lot to learn from it. There's a lot to gather, and there's so much deception that we have to wipe the mud away from everything that's covering up the truth. And and like I pointed out again, and I'll make sure that it's firmly planted in your mind in this broadcast. These issues are affecting politics. They're affecting your local church down the road. They're affecting your state, your county, wherever. These are not small issues. Talmunism and its effect on our country is massive, and we must get to the bottom of it. And I've been very thankful that this is a topic that has gotten brought up more now in my lifetime than ever before, and I'm pretty sure Michael agrees with me because I mean, not very long ago you couldn't even mention this subject to some people. Now, some people are at least willing to hear about it.
I sure hope so because we've spent billions of dollars, approaching no doubt a trillion, on backing up all this mass murder of the Israelis. Now another needless war like the war in Iraq, and we're into it again. It seems like we can't escape it because we're in some kind of hypnotic state. That's
Hmm.
people are hypnotized by these things and they don't seem to be able to break it. But as Christians, we're supposed to be the rulers. We're supposed to occupy till he comes. So
Amen.
it's really a degenerate reversal of the order that God intended for us to have as the real kingship of Christ advocates and ambassadors, rather than being pressed down and feeling that we have to be an adjunct to these counterfeits. And many people are compromising. They know what you and I know, Matthew, but at the
Hmm.
same time, they feel, well, I'll sneak up on them, I'll infiltrate it, or
Yeah.
I can sort of present half the message. No, you can't do that. And by the way, our enemies don't do that. Could we at least
Hmm.
have the courage of our enemies who come right out forthright in a very dark creed that they're promoting, and yet they have the courage to uncompromisingly promote it
Yeah.
without fear. And here we are shaking in our boots, and we claim to be the representatives of Jesus Christ. I don't get it.
I don't either. Who can be against us if we're before God? And how
Amen.
can we claim to be ambassadors of Christ and then be afraid of every Tom, Dick, and Harry out in the world? So we need to stand up and have courage, be courageous, and stand firm in our faith, stand firm for our Lord Jesus Christ, who's King of all, Lord of all. We need to be the representatives. We need to be worthy of having the name Christian put upon us, and many
Amen.
Christians are not. They're cowards,
Amen.
and we need to call people to repentance for that because it is a sin. Being cowardice is a sin, and we need to stand firm in that. Well, I pray those listening out there will send this interview to Douglas Wilson. Perhaps maybe we'll get a debate out of it. I doubt it, but who knows? Maybe he will be encouraged to debate you on this and try to prove you wrong. And I think that'd be a blessing to for him to try to do that. Mr. Hoffman, we only have a few minutes left. If you can give your information out on where the best place to find your book and to keep in touch with you and your Substack articles and so forth for my listeners to go check that out.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity. So, the books and news about our ministry is available from www.revisionisthistory.org. And we've moved from print world to digital world reluctantly. We still issue a couple of newsletters per year, and you can find that information on our website. But largely, I'm doing columns about 2 to 3 times a month. Some of them are extensive studies. I've done about 180 studies on Substack now. There's a free subscription available. People can test it out. There's also a paid subscription where you get the full access to the 180 studies, as well as my weekly columns. And that's at Michael Hoffman. That's all one word, michaelhoffman.substack.com. And if you want to reach us by mail, it's P.O. Box 849, Coeur d'Alene, Idaho 83816.
Fantastic. And they can get all your printed books at your website, or you just say some
Yes.
of them were on Amazon?
No, they can get 7 of the 10 on Amazon. Otherwise, they can get there are some books that I wrote an introduction to that are no longer in print because we sometimes print other valuable books. We printed the book called The Talmud Tested by Dr. Alexander McCall, who in the 19th century was professor of rabbinic literature and Hebrew at King's College London. And that's a very important book that people should have in their library because that book largely proves that the religion of Moses is not the religion of the Talmud. That's basically what he lays out with his brilliant understanding of Hebrew and Aramaic. So I wrote a lengthy introduction to that to place it in context. Earlier, we presented English excerpts from the greatest of all exposés of the Talmud, Entdecktes Judentum, which is actually the title of my book, Judaism Discovered, my textbook. And that one was published by Johann Andreas Eisenmenger, and there's a story behind that. That came out in 1700. The Holy Roman Emperor seized almost all copies of it. It's one of the rarest books in the world. We found an English translation done in the 18th century. We reprinted it. I wrote an extensive introduction in praise of Eisenmenger, but that book initially didn't do well, and without proper financing, it went out of print. But the books that I've written are all in print, and they're available at the website. Yes, sir.
Well, fantastic. Well, I encourage everybody listening to go check out his website, order at least Judaism Strange Gods, and perhaps a copy of all his books that he's written. I would encourage it. And thank you, Michael, for coming on the program. I really appreciate you taking the time to do that and talk to my listeners about this very important subject.
Thank you for the opportunity, Pastor Dyer.
Well, everybody listening to us, I really appreciate you taking the time to listen to Christian American Ministries Worldwide. I've been your host, Matthew Dyer, and I've had Michael A. Hoffman on the program talking about his book, Judaism Strange Gods, and other topics, current events, and Judaism in general, and Talmudism. I would encourage you to go to our YouTube channel, Christian America Ministries, and listen to the full broadcast if you just caught it on the tail end of it, listening to us on Shortwave Radio. I will also say that for our Shortwave Radio audience, if you could go to our website, ChristianAmericaMinistries.org, we'd love to get a reception report from you. And you can do that by clicking the little radio icon at the right-hand corner of the screen. And just let us know how you listen to this program, what frequency, what time, what location. And we'll send you a QSL card as well as a publication from this ministry. So thank you for listening to Christian America Ministries, and come back next week for another broadcast. Have you ever had a knock on the door from someone who was adamant that Jesus wasn't God in the flesh, but rather just Michael the Archangel? Well, you're not alone. Or what about running into a strange loner on the internet that wants to tell you Jesus was simply just a good man, not God? Well, you're also not alone. In the book, Is Jesus God or a God? Scriptural Proof That Jesus is God in the Flesh by Matthew Dyer, it presents scriptural-based evidence addressing who Jesus truly is. You can order a copy or read for free at ChristianAmericaMinistries.org. Are you tired of multiculturalism being crammed down your throat every time you turn around? Are you aggravated at the people calling you a racist just because you're white and you want your children to be white? You're not alone. Explore challenging questions from a biblical perspective in the book, A Case for Biblical Kinism by Matthew Dyer. This concise book examines scripture passages on race, interracial marriage, identity, and many other subjects, addressing topics many want to avoid, but the Bible has a lot to say about. You can order a copy or read for free at ChristianAmericaMinistries.org.
You have been listening to Christian America Ministries Worldwide. If you have been blessed by this outreach ministry, please come back next week for another broadcast. And be sure to subscribe to Christian America Ministries on YouTube and Spotify. If you would like to support this ministry and help keep this program on the air, you can donate to Christian America Ministries at our website, ChristianAmericaMinistries.org. Thank you for listening.